Welcome to the Phoenix Prosperity Podcast, where wealth meets legacy. Join your host, Tim Fergestad, as we explore the journeys of Phoenix's finest to success and beyond.
This is Tim Fergestad. Thank you for joining us. I'm very pleased to have Mohammed Mahmoud with us today. Dr. Mohammed Mahmoud is an internationally experienced water resources management and climate adaptation policy expert. He's from Michigan, is it?
Yes. Moved from Michigan to Arizona.
Okay, like myself, from the Midwest. So we have that in common, and we're both nerds. We both have PhDs. That's great. Living in Phoenix, water is a big issue, and we'll talk about some of that in a little bit here. But why don't you fill in some of the gaps? You have an extensive bio that I figured to let you talk about yourself first, if you don't mind.
Sure, of course. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm happy to be here and looking forward to our conversation. So a little bit about myself, background-wise. So in terms of profession, I'm actually a civil engineer by education. And within that subdiscipline, I started to specialize in issues of water resources as I started to go through my graduate education. And the reason I actually moved to Arizona was to pursue my PhD in hydrology and water resources, originally, at the University of Arizona. So hopefully no hard feelings with the Sun Devils here, although I later on did a little bit of teaching at ASU as a faculty affiliate. But the reason I came here was for my graduate studies. And then after I got my PhD, I moved up to Phoenix and I started working for a regional water provider. Locals may be familiar with the Central Arizona Project or Central Arizona Water Conservation District. And so I worked there for about 10 years on basically water policy, water supply management, looking outwards more on the issue of the Colorado River, which is essentially our predominant water supply, and working on issues across states. It's a river that's shared by multiple states, and resolving some of those issues and collaborative efforts. And then did that for about 10 years, as I mentioned. And during that 10 years, I started to work in different avenues of water management. So I started to look at the impact of climate in terms of affecting our work, looked at environmental issues, and more on climate, more on the adaptation side, right? So as a water provider, how do we continue to serve our business and providing water to our customers while still dealing with issues of warming and how extreme heat, which those of us that live in Phoenix are unfortunately continue to feel in a more amplified manner. I dread to see where the summer is going to take us in terms of that. And so I started to get more into the climate adaptation side. And so when I left CAP, Central Arizona Project, about three years ago, I started working for a DC-based think tank while still living in DC. Remote work was still quite popular. And I started focusing on US and Middle East issues and North Africa issues. So I would travel a lot to the region, working for that organization. It's called the Middle East Institute, looking at climate adaptation issues, water management issues, and not just how it's affecting that part of the world, but also the interface between that part of the world and the US. And Phoenix climate, Arizona climate is quite similar to that part of the world. So there's a lot of knowledge exchange, knowledge sharing that could be gained from what's happening here as well as what's there.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Well, welcome to the show. I'd like to back up now, and the Central Arizona Water Project. I think you said was a prominent water source for us here. I've heard different reports, right? Some people say like Central Arizona or the Phoenix area gets most of its water from groundwater, whereas California gets a lot of theirs from the Colorado. Can you expand a little bit on how that works in the different areas?
Sure, of course. Well, historically, I think Arizona was reliant on groundwater up and through the 80s. Part of that is before that point, the main way we could get water or the main way we have now of how we get water from the Colorado River, which is essentially serves as the border between Arizona and California. The canal, the Central Arizona Project Canal, did not exist. The CAP Canal wasn't built until the 80s and fully complete until the early 90s. And so up until that point, the state was heavily, at least the central portions of the state, were heavily reliant on groundwater. Now, there's other parts of the state. So, for example, you look in the northern part, we have the Salt River and Verde River systems. So, Salt River Project, those that live in Phoenix are familiar with that entity as well, provides water from those sources. But the lion's share of our water supply has always come from the Colorado River. And until the CAP Canal was built, until the 80s, we had to rely on groundwater. Now, post the 80s, with the CAP Canal being built, now we're able to leverage that water supply to support the largest part of our population, which lives in Central Arizona, obviously the Phoenix metro area, Tucson, and in between. Originally, prior to that, the only entities that were able to use that Colorado River were those that were along the river itself. So places like Yuma, a lot of the irrigation and agricultural districts, some Native American communities. So it right now, Colorado River is our primary supply source.
Huh, okay. I've heard mixed things from different groups, and so it's interesting to see what motivates and what you got to dive into the data to really know, I guess.
Of course.
Side question, I just spent a week in California with my family, and coming back through and seeing some of the canals there and here, we were wondering why there isn't like algae growth and all that throughout the canals and turn them into rivers and stuff. Is there some sort of treatment that's done to keep that from happening?
That's a good question. There's a couple of things in play that minimize that. I think when you start seeing stuff like algae growth, you usually see that in more stagnant and still water bodies, right? So that's one factor that allows the proliferation of algae. But then the other piece of it too is waters that are warmer waters tend to produce more algae, right? So
Sure.
The way the canals counteract that, two things. One, a lot of these canal systems are regularly maintained, so they're not just sitting still while these things are happening. So if there is the potential of algae growth, there's maintenance efforts that come in to remove and keep those canals functioning and clean.
Okay.
The other thing is water is moving very fast. It doesn't appear when you look at it. Also, when you're driving, you're probably matching speed in a way, so it looks still. But generally, even when you're looking at it standing still, the water is moving quite fast. It doesn't appear so on the surface. So that also minimizes and disrupts things like algae growth, because that relies on stagnant water, right? But the water is moving very fast.
Sure.
And they also have grates and stuff like that that limits the movement of algae from one section of a canal to the other.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you for that. That was I got to report back to the family on that one. Okay, yeah. Thank you. So how did you get into? Can you talk a little bit more about how you got into the international scene?
Yeah. So when I was transitioning out of CAP, I'd reached a point in my career where I wanted to sort of leverage what I've learned and apply it in a larger scale. And so I've always kind of been interested in the back of my mind to get into international work. Originally I was contemplating going the route of the World Bank or even the United Nations, but unfortunately, a lot of those organizations suffer from deep bureaucracy. And so sometimes getting in is a lot difficult. And a lot of times when you're in there, you don't have as much impact as you'd like in terms of the work that you'll do.
Sure.
A middle ground that sort of appeared to me was looking at the think tank space, which was interesting because it was the interface of policy and in my case, technical and data and information. And I think that's where you make a lot of progress because we have a lot of great academic institutions in Arizona, obviously our great universities here, but around the world. And then you also have policymakers that look at similar issues. So if we look at issues of water and environment, et cetera, but it almost feels like a silo because they're silos because they don't speak the same language. The researchers are very focused on producing work that advances the field, whereas policymakers, decision makers are focused on information or inputs that can help them make better decisions. And those tracks don't always cross well together. And so I found that that space of that interface in between, and certainly the think tank space does that, um, gave me an insight into doing a kind of work that could be both satisfying for me personally in
Okay.
terms of the issues I'm interested in, and also to actually make an impact that could be helpful.
Okay. Interesting. Interesting. Thank you. And I know, just like Arizona, the Middle East and a lot of Africa has serious water crises, really, or serious demands. I know, like water.org, they try to put wells in places and stuff to help out. There's a Phoenix-based company that makes these hydro panels. Are you familiar with those?
If we're talking about the ones that are that sort of collect water through condensation on the panels, is that
Yes.
I think I've
Yeah,
heard
they're
of them.
solar
Yes, yes, yes.
powered.
Yes, 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 yes,
They can
yes.
go anywhere. They have commercial and residential models and stuff. They basically, I think up to or down to 7% humidity, they can extract a certain volume per day, which was pretty impressive.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting technology. I don't dispute that it works. I think we just have to consider where it is most optimal to apply it. Certainly, if places that are more humid, right? So if you think of coastal areas, certainly much of the Middle East is coastal and high humidity, along the Arabian Sea, uh, that will have higher impact. I mean, it can certainly work in Arizona. We certainly have the temperature, the heat to be able to activate the solar panels, but may not be as effective because we're quite arid in Arizona. It's very hot
Right.
and dry.
Right. Okay. I was wondering if you had any experience with them, or if that technology was being promoted outside of the U.S. yet. In some of those
Yeah,
rural areas, it sounds great, right? Because it's just it's off the grid, no electricity.
yeah. My perspective, yes, it has come across my way several points. And the way I look at it too is things like that. I think we all fall into this trap where we see a new technology, right? Whether it's in water and other avenues and disciplines as well. But in this case, you see a technology like that, people always think it's a magic bullet. And
Right.
that's not a good approach to it. I think these technologies and advances are good because they're trying to find ways to address the water scarcity and water security issue. I think the good way to look at it, it's one tool in a toolbox that has multiple tools that we can use.
Right.
And if we deploy them all at the same time, then there is a potential net benefit. But it's not to look at each of them in silo, right? There's other interesting technologies that do the same, similar effect, right? So stuff like cloud seeding, stuff like obviously water recycling, etc. All those things together could make a dent, but we shouldn't look at them in silos because then you're asking too much of a new innovation that is meant to help the problem but not solve it in and of itself.
Right. Speaking of solving problems, back to here in Phoenix, I've heard a lot of suggestions. Right. It was pump water up from Mexico, uphill from Mexico. There was also what sort of future do you see in Arizona?
Yeah, I've heard another one that was popular probably a decade ago was building a pipeline to the Mississippi.
To
Um,
Mississippi.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the idea originally was that the Mississippi floods periodically, right? We always hear every several years that these
Right.
flooding issues, and the idea was to leverage the floodwaters so that it would help regulate the river. But I think much like the example used with Mexico, what prohibits all that, of course, is cost, right? So one is the construction cost of such a huge pipeline or canal system
Right.
to move water for vast distances, which probably sounds ironic because I just talked about the CAP Canal, which is
Right.
about 300 miles long. And that's, I'd argue that was more of a necessity for lack of any other effective alternative. But I think we reached a point where cost is a factor, but I think also people maybe neglect that the maintenance of such a grand infrastructure project is a huge investment cost. And if things go awry in terms of part of that infrastructure failing, right? So if you have that pipeline, even from Mexico, which isn't obviously as long as distances to the Mississippi, a panel fails, it starts to leak water. I mean, that becomes a very serious issue, not just in terms of now you lose that water supply for however amount of time it takes to fix it, but dumping that amount of water, depending on the volume, wherever it is, could be catastrophic
Sure.
as well.
Sure. Yeah, now you have me wondering about the efficacy or what's sort of been the return on the Central Arizona Water Project. It made a concrete river through the state. It was a big endeavor, a lot of the cost associated with it, I'm sure. How well has that been working?
I think it's been working well. There was a study that came out while I was still there talking about the economic benefit that the project brought to Arizona. And it was, I forget the figure, but it was a substantial GDP amount in terms of dollars of economic revenue that the canal, essentially supported through its existence. I mean, you got to think from a very basic
Sure.
idea when you think about real estate, right? So, and people moving in and homes and building homes, a lot of that wouldn't be possible without an adequate water supply. And so it served that very critical function to be able to do that. In fact, there's one of the laws that is in place in Arizona that's part of the original groundwater management code that came out in the 80s, is this idea of assured water supply or renewable water supply, meaning new development cannot be built unless they can demonstrate that they're getting their water supply from a renewable source. And the reading between the lines, that basically means that they're able to acquire Colorado River water from whichever entities, primarily CAP or other entities that are able to acquire said water. So there's a check and balance with that in terms of development and growth tied to the amount of water that we have available in the state.
Right. And that's, I believe is it 100 years supply? Is that usually what they want to see?
Correct. Which is also code for it has to be renewable. And renewable basically means it's not groundwater, right?
I see.
Because groundwater is quite finite as a supply source.
Okay. That was another question is how has the groundwater replenished itself over the years with the demands?
Not very well naturally, because as we said, this is an arid and hot state, so we don't get as much rain or enough rain to do that sufficiently, considering how much groundwater has been pumped.
So it's predominantly rainfall is the replenishing nature of pretty much all the groundwater.
Natural, but a lot of it actually happens through artificial recharge. So which is actually taking water and injecting it underground or allowing it to naturally infiltrate. And so that's how in Arizona, at least, most of that replenishment
takes some of that Central Arizona Water Project water and puts it into the aquifers at different places.
Yeah, and there's legal mechanisms of how that's done, and it's not necessarily the state itself. There's mechanisms where, for example, there's parts of Central Arizona that has a lot of agricultural irrigation districts, right? And so a lot of them maybe are a little bit removed from supply sources, so they rely on groundwater. But then what ends up happening if that aquifer is in proximity to the canal, then you'll see some of that water used to offset the pumping of some of those irrigation districts. So a lot of it is replenishment, sort of almost on paper, water on paper to offset some of the pumping. But there are other areas where replenishment is happening to supersede what's being pumped beyond just balancing it out.
Okay. Thank you. Interesting. Yeah. So how was CAP and your tenure there, as well as your other positions? How has that contributed to your growth and success?
Well, like anything you do in your career, everything is incremental, right? So you take a little bit of something from everything that you do to kind of move you to the next stage career-wise. I think it also gives you an opportunity to learn what you like and what you don't like, and then also what you're comfortable with, what you're not comfortable with, and then what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. I mean, of course, we talk about it broadly in terms of experience, but as part of that experience, you learn also what are some of the things that are maybe ethical or moral, or things that align with your particular values and the things you want to do. And so, there's a lot I learned from the CAP experience. Got to work with some great people. Of course, any part of your career experience, there are things that are also not so positive, but you learn from those as well.
Sure.
And
perhaps even more so.
Perhaps even more so, right? It tells you exactly what you don't want to do, or sometimes the type of people you don't want to work with. But it's interesting how certain things kind of take you to a particular direction, and sometimes it isn't the things that you expect. So, for example, I started as a civil engineer and broadly thought I was going to go into water engineering. And I started delving into water policy. And then from water policy, I started to look at the interface of climate and water. And that took me to the international scale. And now I'm looking at issues of policy and science broadly. So it's sometimes your career path is deliberate, and sometimes like those cartoons, you have those lights, those big arrows pointing in a certain direction. Sometimes
Sure.
it's a mix of both.
Sure, but and all those changes have risks associated with them too, right? When you're comfortable,
Yeah.
you got to go out and take chances.
Yeah, I mean, when I made the transition to the think tank space, that happened early in the pandemic. It was around 2021. So, that was a time where things were quite volatile and unstable in terms of where things were going to go. And so, making a career move, especially one that was so drastic, at least in terms of the type of work, was also a risk. But one way where I mitigated that risk, which is regardless of the type of work I do, is I always keep Phoenix my home. I love living here. This is my home in every sense of the word. And so even when I agreed to do that job at the think tank, when I was director of their Climate and Water program, the founding director of the Climate and Water program, I also pushed back to work remote. I think the plan originally was to try to move there, and it was in DC, which has its positives and negatives. Those have been to DC, but I made sure that I stayed in Arizona because I feel for me, Phoenix keeps me grounded in a number of ways. Home is sort of your safe haven. And, for all the travels and all the work and all the places I go, it's sort of the place that I come back to that is home. And it's where I feel the most comfortable and safe. So I think that's something, regardless of the next thing I'll end up doing, which is, I'm in transition at the moment in terms of moving to a different career path or type of work. Phoenix is the place that keeps me grounded.
Okay. Yeah, Phoenix is great. We're here by choice.
Yeah. Even now, right? Even as we're about to enter blistering temperatures.
We're recording this in June 2024.
Yeah, exactly. Still a choice.
Yeah. When I think about international water, I also am reminded of that James Bond movie when he's trying to figure out what the evil organization Spectre is doing, and they're talking about controlling the most important resource on Earth, and he's like, "What are they talking about?"
Yeah,
it was water, right?
Yeah, it's like that famous Mark Twain saying, right? Whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting, and it's unfortunate because I feel that it's such an understated issue. I mean, when you think about even Phoenix and Arizona as a whole, we had a pretty large population boom, certainly since the pandemic, but I'd say it started before then.
Right.
But people that move here don't really understand sort of the critical nature of water towards us being able to live here. And in many other places, right? When people make a decision to move or to seek opportunities elsewhere, they're focusing on the economic side of things, right? There's a job, I'm making this much, there's this opportunity, whatever the case may be, but they don't think about sort of the hard boundaries in terms of living conditions. And in a place like Arizona, a place like Phoenix, water is a critical issue. I think it's changing now, where people are becoming more aware because now it's entering their daily life. It's an issue that's part of their day to day, as opposed to the second or third tier problem. But even in other parts of the world, certainly other parts of the developed world, people don't think about it as much, and I
Right.
think that needs to change.
A lot of people in the US who come to Arizona, it was never on the radar before. So yeah, they don't have an appreciation for it. But it's
Exactly.
important. It's particularly when you're, as you say, when you're fighting, which reminds me of a different writer, Rudyard Kipling's Gunga Din. When it comes to slaughter, you will do your work on water and you'll lick the bloomin' boots of him that's got it.
That's a good one.
So this is the Phoenix Prosperity Podcast. Your water stuff sounds amazing and things are going well for you. I want to hear about what you're doing in the future, but also what you're doing on a personal as well as professional level to get your prosperity, keep it moving forward. Are you
Absolutely.
investing in certain things? Do you have business endeavors? Can you talk about what your plans for the future are?
Sure. Some of my plans. So some of this is still in motion. So I don't want to over advertise too much. But as I kind of hinted at, I left the think tank space, specifically the organization I was with, to really kind of branch off on my own. And to focus on leading efforts on my own with a couple of cohorts and collaborators that I've sort of met and established and worked with over the last few years to advance the issue of water globally. And so one of the things I'm looking at doing is sort of launching an initiative focused on interface of water and climate. So similar to what I was doing, but actually remove some of the limitations of just working for a particular organization or under a particular brand. And so my plan is by the end of the summer to launch that initiative and to continue to do work in this area in terms of not just thought leadership and policy work in terms of content and publications and media content on some of the prevailing issues that we all face, but then also look at educational avenues of providing training and education and understanding some of these issues for corporate and legal entities, ministries, governments, etc., around the world that are affected or involved with issues of water, climate, and the environment. And then, of course, consult through that avenue as well, provide sort of consulting expertise.
That's all exciting. That's some new stuff for you. That's excellent.
Yeah.
In the real estate space, one of the things we often do with our apartment complexes, in particular, because there's a lot of people living there, is a lot of water conservation techniques and approaches, which can save a lot on expenses, right? Which is a big financial aspect to us. How are you strategizing your financial plan for this endeavor?
Well, it's a lot of it is thankfully just bringing things I've done with me, right? So in terms of the network that I built and the collaborators and cohorts that I've supported, and so that makes it a little bit easier. I'm not necessarily starting from scratch. It's sort of bringing the audience and cohort that I had with me to help support this type of effort and work. Like I said, we're still in the kitchen cooking phase, right? So thankfully, it's happening over the summer where people kind of slow to a lull a little bit worldwide, so that once the fall comes around, we'll be able to have a formal launch of our activities.
Okay. Reflecting back, what do you wish is the question I always like the answers to. Different people have different things and stuff, but what do you wish you knew about building wealth and success earlier in your career?
My answer may seem a little bit cliche. What do they say? Hindsight is 20/20 now that I'm older. My advice, and I say this to my young, family members and my nieces and nephews, is start early, start soon. It's never too late to invest. It's never too late to save. It's never too late to leverage your financial resources, limited as they may seem when you're starting off your career, towards building wealth. And part of that, the magic word, right, is compounding interest, right? Growth of wealth over time, right? You have to start somewhere. I think, we fall into this trap when we're younger, when we first start making money, right, out of school, whatever your first job is, which in retrospect, you're like, that wasn't a lot of money. But when you come out of school, it seems quite, from making no money to making money is a big jump. We fall into this trap of just spending, right? So buying, I have to buy this fancy car, this whatever consumer product that
Right.
is trendy or catchy or whatever. And so a lot of the younger folks, the younger people, tend to buy stuff that they don't need or spend money in a way that is very inefficient. The reality is, if you make incremental changes in how you uh, utilize your money, so right off the bat, investing into, it could be a 401k. I mean, just to get your feet wet as a person who's just entered the workforce,
Right.
or even just saving money, just putting money aside, which then, as it grows, you can later leverage into other types of investments. With time, 10 years later, the amount of money that you would have acquired, or funds, would 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 be amazing. And so my advice is, start early and start young. But I feel, as older people, we've been saying that, we reach a point and we say that to, our younger friends and family members. And I think the reason we keep saying is it doesn't quite hit. Experience is a painful and cruel teacher, and I think most of us learn that, with time. And unfortunately, several of us learn that maybe too late, or it's never too late to invest. Of course, never too
Right.
late to smartly use your money. But
Right. You keep bringing up time. That's it. Right. Start soon, and no matter when, just start, because it takes time.
Exactly.
What's the Chinese proverb? If the best time to plant a tree was 30 years ago, the next best time is today.
Exactly. So, that's my advice. That's my advice on wealth.
Excellent. Thank you. For our listeners who want to learn more about you or connect, where can they find you?
Probably the best way is on LinkedIn. If you search me on LinkedIn, Mohammed Mahmoud, PhD, usually that is enough for me to pop up, and I'm posting there all the time on our work, contributions, engagements, that type of stuff on the field of water, climate, environment. So if you're interested in that, both in the US and internationally, find me on LinkedIn, follow me, add me, and it's a good way to keep in touch.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for watching, and thank you, Mohammed Mahmoud. It's Mahmoud.
No, you hit it right the first time.
Right.
Thank you. I've heard worse pronunciations, but you got it just right. So I appreciate that.
Well, thank you for joining me today. We appreciate you sharing your insights and water knowledge, and your advice for success and impact. It's all very important stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Inspired by our guests? Visit phoenixprosperitypodcast.com/guest and join us on the show and share your success story with Tim. The spotlight awaits.